Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon, thank you very much. And with the Taliban refusing to turn over Osama bin Laden, what's ahead for the United States and its allies? Joining us now with his thoughts on some of the options standing before the president is Jim Steinberg. He's with the Brookings Institute. He's a former Deputy National Security Advisor to former President Bill Clinton. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Steinberg. The whole nature of getting the attention of the Taliban leadership, has the President Bush, succeeded in getting their attention? Do they understand what's potentially going to happen?
I think they understand very well what's going to happen. They've seen the military deployments. They've heard the president's very categorical ultimatum. I think they know what's coming, but I think they made a decision that they've suffered a lot before. They've been in difficult military situations before, and that right now they're just going to tough it out.
It is the ratcheting up of the pressure. Is that the kind of strategy that will work with the Taliban, presumably Osama bin Laden, or is it going to have to require just a full thrust of attack and then see what happens?
I think there's always a remote chance that it'll work, and that's why you have to put the pressure on. But you also have to tell the rest of the international community that you've given them a last clear chance to deliver this guy, to avoid what's going to be coming. I think the administration is ready for it. In some respects, I think, given the problems before, that they're doubtful, even if they got kind of a halfway answer from the Taliban, that it would be helpful. They see this as a problem that needs to be dealt with, and dealt with decisively.
We have a question from a viewer who emails us with this. In pariah states, the leadership does not answer to the population. Why is the population then considered as legitimate targets?
I don't think that the administration will treat the population as a legitimate target. I think they're going to try to be focused on the best strategic targets they can find. Of course, the problem is there aren't many strategic targets in Afghanistan. They don't have large, massed military forces. They don't have significant communications facilities that we can target. But I'm sure the administration is thinking very hard about how not to have civilian casualties, how not to turn the public opinion against us.
All right, Jim Steinberg, former Deputy National Security Advisor, President Clinton, now at the Brookings Institution. Thanks for joining us. And we're going to take a quick break. More news when we come back. Stay with us.
A human, a caring member of one's community,
sure,
and an American, and those are more important things. And in something such as this, an extraordinary circumstance, I don't know of anyone who every second of every day can hold it in every way. I certainly can.
Did you find yourself struggling as the news got worse, the death toll rose, the buildings were collapsing? I mean, that's got to be really hard not to react just as a human as opposed to a professional anchor person.
Well, did it get more difficult as the terrible news got worse and worse? Yes. What I tried to do, and I think what most people who do this line of work try to do when that sort of thing happens, but let me again just speak for myself.
Sure.
Because I remember when I was a younger reporter, much the same sort of wave of horror, sadness, anger, and rage went over me as a much younger reporter then. And I remember saying to myself in Dallas at the start of those 4 dark days, just, get focused, stay focused. And so what you try to do is get in a zone, what I think the tennis players and maybe baseball and football players, dancers call a zone. All you're focused on is your work, and you have a laser beam focus. Now, in television studio work, such as anchor work, it's somewhat easier than it is in the field, because after all, you do look the camera right in the eye. I try to look, at someone just past the camera. So my point is, it's a little easier to keep that kind of laser beam focus.
But since you brought it up, did the World Trade Center disaster, the Pentagon attack, did it remind you in some ways of what happened with Jack Kennedy in 1963?
Yes, but I wouldn't want to go too far with those similarities, Howard, and I have thought some about this, because the World Trades, what happened at the World Trade Center, what happened at the Pentagon, what happened in Southwest Pennsylvania, these terrible things, one knew from almost the first second, certainly the first minutes, that there were a lot of people involved. With the Kennedy assassination, we simply didn't know. Also with the Kennedy assassination, we had 4 dark days in Dallas, but there was a beginning, a middle, and a predictable end to that story as it developed. with this story, it's just the ongoing, unrelenting quality of it, I would say.
And in those first hours and those first days, when the charges and the rumors were flying and mistakes were made, for example, 5 people were said to have been dug out of the World Trade Center rubble after 2 days, and it turned out to be a couple of firefighters who had fallen into a hole a couple of hours earlier. Did CBS, CNN, other news organizations, were they a little too quick on the trigger?
Well, I can't speak for any other news organization because
CBS?
we were on the air all the time, but we're speaking for ourselves. That I did say to myself, said to our people, and I said to the audience in the beginning, a couple of things. One, steady is a very important word. We wanted our coverage, and I think the record shows it was. We wanted to be steady and reliable, wanted to be accurate. But, you know, I know as a lifetime reporter that frequently the first things you hear are wrong. And yes, we made some mistakes.
Sometimes you hear them from senior government officials, and the information simply turns out to be wrong.
And you hear them from high-ranking police officers.
Right.
And even though you check it out, you know, you never met anybody that felt stronger that you trust your mother, but you cut the cards, which is another way of saying, whatever it is, you always check it out. But it is difficult, and this is not by way of making an excuse, because when it comes to mistakes, you know, I'm responsible, I'm accountable, I'm to blame for what we put on the air. But I think the audience has come to understand with this kind of coverage, where there's a deadline every nanosecond, it's impossible to be absolutely perfectly accurate every time. Now, what is necessary for us, and what I've reminded myself that we need to do, and perhaps we haven't done it as much as we should, but I hope we have, is to explain that to the public, and also, when we are wrong, when we find out we're wrong, to very quickly say so with no excuses. Don't try to dress it up or, you know, sidestep it. Listen, we made a mistake, this is how we made the mistake, this is why we made the mistake, and move on.
Understood.
But I do agree, Howard, that it's very, very important in these circumstances to work as hard as you can to be as absolutely accurate as you can.
Okay. In the current environment, this rally around the president environment, does it seem to you, Dan Rather, that there was a danger, at least, that journalists will be reluctant to criticize the Bush administration and the Pentagon for fear of a public backlash?
I think that's probably true, but I think what's more important, and let me again just speak for myself, that particularly in the early stages, and I would continue to say that these are the early stages, that it's less a fear of the backlash. Listen, I've had backlash, man, have I ever had it, and a lot of times justified. I'm not afraid of the backlash. What I want to do, I want to fulfill my role as a decent human member of the community and a decent and patriotic American, and therefore I am willing to give the government, the president, and the military the benefit of any doubt here in the beginning. I'm going to fulfill my role as a journalist, and that is ask the questions, when necessary, ask the tough questions. But I have no excuse for, particularly when there's a national crisis such as this, is saying, you know, the president says, do your job, whatever you are and whoever you are, Mr. and Mrs. America. I'm going to do my job as a journalist. But at the same time, I will give them the benefit of the doubt whenever possible in this kind of crisis emergency situation, not because I'm concerned about any backlash, I'm not,
okay,
but because I want to be a patriotic American without apology.
Well, speaking of patriotic Americans, there is a bubbling controversy in the business, as you probably know, about whether journalists on the air should wear these little lapel flags. NBC's Tim Russert did it on Meet the Press. ABC News has barred its people from doing that. Does it seem to you that journalists who show the flag are being patriotic, or are they somehow kind of turning into cheerleaders for Team USA?
It's an individual decision. I have no argument with anyone who does it. I don't intend to do it myself, but I understand those who do it. I want to make it explicitly clear that
why would you
no
not do it? Why would you not wear a flag yourself?
It doesn't feel right to me. I have the flag, you know, burned in my heart. I have ever since infancy, and I just don't feel the need to do it. It just doesn't feel right to me, and I try to be, particularly in times such as this. I try to be in touch with my inner self, with my true inner self, and I try to listen. And my inner self says, you don't need to do that. But I have absolutely no argument with anyone else who feels differently.
Okay, we have to take a short break. More with our conversation with Dan Rather in a moment.
We didn't make it interesting enough. We didn't try and work hard enough to report to people why they should care about some stories. And number two, it was used by almost everybody in electronic journalism, I know of no exceptions, as an excuse to cut back on foreign coverage, what used to be called foreign coverage, now everybody insists on calling it international coverage, as an excuse to cut back on it because it is the most expensive kind of coverage to do. But you know, I never believed this idea the public was not interested. We have a very heavy responsibility and to answer the question of why we wrecked, in many ways, our overseas coverage. You know, some more than others, some people and some very big news organizations virtually got out of the international news coverage business. But everybody cut back, and there was no excuse for it, and there is no excuse for it.
I suspect we'll see some people trying to rebuild some of those resources. Let's talk a little bit about coverage of the president. You were a White House correspondent during Watergate, when Richard Nixon, the embattled President Nixon, was the center of the media universe. During the Cold War, reporters were always stationed at the White House to report on Ronald Reagan, for example, how he might respond to something the Soviets might do. Will there be a lot more 24-hour focus on George Bush as a war president, now that the stakes seem so high as opposed to the days when he was, for example, fighting over the lockbox?
Yes, absolutely, there will be. Ever since the Kennedy assassination, I do think that was a watershed event in the terms that we're talking now, as well as many others. Ever since then, there's been a tendency to overcover, if anything, the presidency in the White House. Manifesting itself now, in which, I don't know, there are certainly hundreds, if not thousands, of people accredited to be White House correspondents, but it's going to do nothing but increase. With a war presidency, it's inevitable.
Do you think now that we're headed into an era of more serious and sober news, as opposed to, devoting lots of airtime to sharks and Tom and Nicole and stories of that kind? Or 3 months from now, 6 months from now, as this story ebbs and flows, will we slip back into covering mini scandals and celebrities and some of the lighter fare in the news business?
Well, it's a key question. I wish I had the answer to it, Howie. I hope, and I honestly do believe, that for a long period now, there will be a rethink among American journalists, in particular those of us in television, about concentrating more on serious news. But I've thought that a number of times before. For example, in the wake of the Gulf War, I thought there'd be a re-emphasis on foreign coverage. There wasn't. I thought there'd be a sort of return to our journalistic base camp of trying to report more about things that are important, perhaps at the extent of things that are interesting, like celebrity news. And I was wrong then, so I'm a little reluctant to make a prediction. But I think, given the seriousness of what's happened here, that for at least the short and medium range future, that there will be a re-emphasis on more serious news coverage. I certainly hope so.
It does have the feel of a major league wake-up call. Given the very widespread and low opinion of the news business, particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, why do you think that in a recent Pew Research poll, 89% gave positive marks to the media for the coverage of this tragedy over the last couple of weeks? Why the shift?
I hope it's because the coverage was pretty good. Mind you, I think we deserved what we got in the preceding 10 or 15 years, and I do not exempt myself from that criticism. I think the public was right on point. But when this story broke, I mean, what journalist could not say, man, this is really serious for my country, and for that matter for the world, and I want to get out and do a really responsible job. And even those journalistic entities who had strayed very far from what I considered to be the best journalism pull themselves together. So I think it must be that the public looked and they listened, and even though we made mistakes, saw how hard we were trying and felt that we did a pretty good job. And there may be a lesson in that for us, and I won't give you my full sermon about it, but my experience over a lifetime in journalism, Howie, is that when you try to do integrity-filled journalism, the public will respond. There's always somebody to tell you that's not the truth. So there's always somebody to tell you that isn't true, and somebody runs a focus group or a poll. Sure. But that's been my experience.
Okay, we have about 10 seconds for an abbreviated sermon. You've covered Vietnam, impeachment, a disputed election, a lot of hurricanes. Think this will end up being the biggest story of your career?
Yes.
Okay, can't ask for a briefer answer than that. Dan Rather, CBS News, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Howie.
Veteran CBS News anchor Dan Rather talking to us about the challenges of covering this most difficult story, one that won't get any easier in the days and weeks ahead. Wolf Blitzer and I will be back in a moment.